We just have this pure theater, this pure political theater where, maybe Boris Johnson gets to think of himself and even be seen by the global media and to some extent the global public as a climate champion because he gave a really emphatic speech.
The point that has been made by other activists is there's very little here to talk about actually limiting carbon emissions, preventing new wells from being drilled, which makes me feel like, even though we're all supposed to be rooting for BBB, makes me feel like the Biden administration and everyone who is kind of cheerleading right now is part of a kind of climate denialism.
It's the wealthy nations of the world who've destroyed the planet and who've gotten rich by poisoning it. What is the obligation of people in countries like ours to people in countries of the global south and the developing world who have done so little and are going to suffer so much? It is possible when you get in the weeds of a lot of this climate stuff to feel more optimistic than we had felt we had a right to a couple of years ago. So it would not surprise me if AOC was genuinely, and because of real information, feeling like prospects looked brighter than they did when she was really raging about the Green New Deal a couple of years ago. I think that's totally plausible. But I do simultaneously think that it's a little strange and disorienting to see someone who understands how disproportionate the impacts are, not just globally, as we've talked about in this episode, but also within the country, between, it's not the rich people of the US who are going to suffer. It's like at the international level, at the national level, at the community level, at every level, it's the poor who are also often, the marginalized people in other ways who are going to suffer most from climate change. She knows that. She knows that if we are suddenly looking at a 2.5 degree world instead of a 4.5 degree world, that is good news. But it doesn't mean that we're back. It means we also have to manage a ton of likely suffering, even within our borders. And there'll be a lot more elsewhere in the world that we'll have to deal with even just thinking in terms of American politics, we'll be dealing with the ramifications of, even putting aside the sort of moral questions.
The Bronx is on the water.
Yeah, it's a little strange. I mean, I don't really know. I mean, I think I don't really have an explanation or any intimate understanding. It seems, like I said, it's reasonable to be feeling yourself more optimistic. And sometimes I feel the same way where I'm like, I know I told you 3 years ago that the apocalypse was coming and it's only going to be half an apocalypse.
Yeah, David, that book of yours scared the bejesus out of people. It was horrifying.
All of that is still true. It's just we're likelier to end up on the relatively calm end of that spectrum rather than the relatively horrific one, but it's still a spectrum of horror. And I try to keep both of those things in mind to understand that things are improving and, the outlook looks better, but also that we've already entirely lost the opportunity to avoid some of these impacts. But, I think when you're really in the weeds of policy, sometimes all you see is the first thing, the progress that's being made. And it can be a little hard to keep in mind the big picture. And for me, just to really give a big picture, Jim Hansen gave his first testimony before the US Senate in 1988 about global warming. If we had started to decarbonize then, we wouldn't have even had to get to net zero by 2100. We had 130 years to decarbonize. Now, without large-scale negative emissions, we have about 15. And the longer we wait now, the less time we'll have still. So this, if we just fulfill the climate pledges that we put into place now and don't accelerate them, those extend to about 2030. At that point, we would have to basically go all the way from where we were, which will be about 90% of where we are globally in terms of carbon emissions, all the way to zero, basically instantaneously to stay below 1.5 degrees.
Right. That's why the deadlines at a certain point are a kind of magic trick, where you could decline, imagine for people not watching but listening, an exponential curve that kind of dips low and cruises along the x-axis for a while.
Yeah.
But the way we're doing it is that it stays up high, and they're anticipating some cliff right before 2030, which results in much more carbon being emitted over that term, that 10-year term, than if we were to cut earlier and sooner.
And I think there's also a way in which the messaging from even just a decade ago or half decade ago, certainly 2 decades ago, still hangs in our head. And it's like, we have Al Gore saying, let's change our light bulbs. And we think that like small changes make, more energy efficiency, a little bit more renewables are the solution. And they may have actually been the solution in like the year 1994, because we didn't have to move that quickly. But if we do that now, the impact will be so trivial compared to and especially if we only implement those. So if we implement the solutions we think are necessary now, starting in 2035, we're going to be in the same bind.
Final hot take, David. Al Gore caused the climate crisis.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a spicy episode.
Who can argue with that? Yeah.
I am very glad to be joined by repeat offender on Bad Faith Podcast, David Wallace-Wells. You know him, you loved him, author of Uninhabitable Earth, also a columnist for New York Magazine.
Yeah, my title's editor-at-large, but that basically just means that I write and occasionally sit on meetings.
All right. Well, your latest piece on climate as reparations was really gripping, and I hope we get into that. But first and foremost, I want to say welcome. Help orient the audience a little bit, if you will, to all of the kind of big climate things that are going on right now. On one hand, we have COP26, the big climate conference, going on in Glasgow. And on the other hand, we have the Build Back Better agenda, which is promising historical climate reforms. How should people understand? Let's start with the latter, what we've actually achieved with this infrastructure bill that's passed and what is left to be desired.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's been passed is significant, historic, but woefully inadequate. It's mostly an investment in resilience, adaptation measures. It's not the kind of grand turnover of the whole economy that I think climate advocates and most people on the left have been hoping for. That stuff is basically tabled for the part of the agenda that is sitting in limbo now. And if that bill that is now sitting in limbo eventually passes, we're talking about I think it's something on the order of $500 billion invested on climate issues, which would be, dwarf anything that Obama managed and would put us, I think, not quite all the way to meeting Biden's climate goals of cutting our carbon emissions basically in half by 2030. But it would get us pretty close and do a relatively good job of like saving what seemed like a dead climate legislative prospect once Joe Manchin spiked the clean electricity program that had previously been in the bill. I think there is enough in there. It's like very piecemeal. It's hard exactly to game out, but I think the best analysis suggests if all this stuff went through, we'd be doing almost as well as we would have done if Joe Manchin wasn't our senator in West Virginia, and maybe, and again, probably not like wouldn't get us all the way to the goals that we have, but would represent really significant and from any objective perspective, historic progress. But that's not to say that it's enough. I mean, it's like everything on climate, we're never doing enough, even when we're doing way more than we've ever done before.
This is what I struggle with a little bit, because we're told that the goals themselves are kind of a last-ditch effort, right? Getting down to the emissions goals by 2030 isn't in and of itself a mitigation strategy. Now we hear that the plan, as its best design, like the most optimistic version of what can get passed, won't even get us to that goal. And still we have people who are ostensibly the most left flank of our electeds kind of celebrating and framing the bill as a real win, and even kind of presenting the United States, at COP26 as though it's in a sort of a leadership position. I don't know if you caught AOC's recent remarks that were kind of setting the left abuzz a little bit.
America is back at COP, and on the international stage as a leader in climate action and drawdown. One thing that I think is so exciting about this time is that when we say that the United States is back, it's not just that we're back in the way that the United States was pursuing climate policy before. It is different. And I would argue that it's a fundamentally different approach.
The idea that it's a fundamentally different approach, I mean, something from nothing is fundamentally different, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a complicated thing to talk about, but it's, the U.S. is, quote unquote, back in the Paris Accords. We're participating in these negotiations. We're talking the talk. We're giving speeches, Joe Biden, but also John Kerry. Also, we have tons of reps over there who are like trying to urge the world to, quote unquote, greater ambition. They are doing more than they've done in the recent past. But, the baseline here is like not that the U.S. is this incredible climate leader. Over the 30 so years that we've known this as a geopolitical problem, the U.S. has again and again sabotaged and backed away from global agreements to reduce carbon emissions. We have our emissions are declining, but they're not declining all that rapidly. We are now the world's biggest oil producer, as Barack Obama bragged about as president.
Thanks, Obama.
I do wonder sometimes whether he that's one of the things that he may actually regret doing.
He's shown no contrition, right? The other kind of clip that went viral out of COP26 so far is the clip of Obama kind of putting it all on the youth, saying it's climate activists, it's the youth organizers that are ultimately going to be the ones that push governments into action, which feels like a kind of admission that we do have this disconnect between what the people want, what the voters want, and what politicians are willing to do absent activism, which kind of like speaks to that Princeton study from a few years ago that says we live in an oligarchy. There's no relationship. There's like zero relationship between the interest and the will of the populace and the electeds.
Yeah, COP is such an interesting theater that it's watching unfold. The one thing that I've noticed is how much more urgent the rhetoric is coming from political leaders who are basically doing very little in their home countries, but the rhetoric itself, the speeches themselves are like, it is basically like Greta's up there on stage when Boris Johnson is speaking. They are talking this existential language. And what's interesting to me is that they are doing that, sort of knowing that not much is going to come out of this conference. In general, in the big picture, the world is, quote unquote, moving in the right direction, but moving far too slowly to achieve the goals that we've set for ourselves. That's the place we are. This conference is not changing that in any meaningful way. And so to open it, knowing that that's going to be the end game, talking about, this being a last chance for humanity, talking about, our being minutes from the midnight and the doomsday clock. It's just a strange choice for political leaders to make, to like really, really go hard on the really dramatic existential language of climate activists without doing anything to deliver their goals and hopes. And I personally, there's a ways of looking at that that's generous, that they're trying to rally the troops, that they, that there is some sort of self-criticism in the case of Obama and others who are who do feel shamed by the climate activists. Maybe some people are even just intimidated by the climate activists and feel the need to say something. But what I really worry about is that we're seeing something play out in global climate politics that we've sort of seen play out in American domestic politics, where that we have this sort of break between policy and politics in a really profound way, where we have elections hanging on things that have very little to do with the power of elected leaders and what they're promising to do, et cetera. And instead, we just have this pure theater, this pure political theater, where maybe Boris Johnson gets to think of himself and even be seen by the global media and to some extent the global public as a climate champion because he gave a really emphatic speech, even though, there are all these ways in which the British government is standing in the way of climate action, and even their most ambitious plans are sort of would bring us far short of stated goals. So there's this huge gap between rhetoric and reality over there in COP. And I don't really know what the world is going to make of that. Activists over the last few days have been staging protests and really angrily pointing this out. But I think that as the conference wraps up, we're likely to see a round of sort of self-congratulatory applause from prime ministers and presidents all around the world, and indeed from some sort of more pedigreed establishment climate advocates and scientists, just because they don't want to seem like they're expressing sour grapes about this process.
Right. But I have no problem with that on this podcast. I'll do it for them.
Yeah.
Well, what it feels like is that there's already a gaslighting that's begun.
Totally.
And it's a little ironic since we're supposed to be bringing emissions down. All of these gaseous emissions are coming out of these talks. You quoted Greta Thunberg, famous pigtailed activist, in your piece as saying, "Build back better, blah, 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 green economy, blah, 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 net zero by 2050, blah, blah, blah. I'm calling COP26 the first blah, blah, blah COP. It's going to be all blah, blah, blah." What do we do with that? It feels like even Greta Thunberg, who is like the iconic, hopeful, youthful, Heidi-like character that's supposed to, there's like the resource for all of our ambitions and how the world can be better, feels like she sounds like a cynical 67-year-old drunk at a bar.
I mean, I think that's she's just she's telling us the truth. It's the problem is that we have set ourselves, I mean, it's not a problem, but we have set ourselves a goal of keeping temperature levels, global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. It is moral. It is urgent that, that we do everything we can to achieve that. But it is, I think, practically speaking at this point, impossible, like literally impossible to do that. And that means that all of this Sturm und Drang is inevitable because nothing we can do. I mean, in 2018, when the world scientists released their big 1.5 degree report, what they said famously in urging us to cut our emissions in half by 2030 was that would require a World War II scale mobilization globally, right, starting in 2019. They didn't say, put a $50 carbon tax and it'll solve everything. Not that we're about to actually enact a $50 carbon tax, but they didn't say, subsidize like the purchase of e-vehicles with tax credits and that'll solve everything. They were not talking about marginal policy nudges. They were talking about a whole-scale, society-wide revolution starting a couple years ago now, right, to give us just a 50-50 chance of avoiding levels of warming that were considered catastrophic. And I think there are ways in which that framing may be slightly hyperbolic, but we're in a situation now where even if we are maximally ambitious, even if we move really, really quickly and decarbonize basically as fast as we can possibly imagine, we're still going to fall short of the goals we've set for ourselves. Now, that raises a really interesting question, is like, should we still be talking about that goal, which is the moral one, or should we move on to more achievable ones so that we can bring our rhetoric back into line with real reality? And frankly, I don't know the answer to that question. The piece I wrote last week in New York about climate reparations and climate justice, there are a lot of technical things about how we might be able to undo the damage that we've already done to the climate. But at a basic level, I was just really focused on the moral injustice of this ecological crime, which is to say, it's the wealthy nations of the world who've destroyed the planet and who have gotten rich by poisoning it. What is the obligation of people in countries like ours to people in countries of the global south and the developing world who have done so little and are going to suffer so much? And I can say that, and I can also say, we're not going to do enough. I don't feel at all confident that we're going to do enough. And so I wonder, like, what is the value of that moral framing versus the sort of more pragmatic, like, let's applaud the fact that we're looking at a future of, say, 2.5 degrees, a likely future of 2.5 degrees as opposed to 4 degrees, which is something that a sort of a technocrat might say we should applaud. We're in a really tricky spot, and we're in a tricky spot because we've done so little for so long.
Well, to your point in that article, making a decision that sounds like a matter of 1 degree or 2 degrees off of where we were aiming for, the consequence of that is literally millions, if not billions of lives.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that modeling is really complicated. It's hard to trust exactly, but, at least, we're talking about real suffering for billions of people. I would say that for sure.
I mean, what's the statistic I remember from Uninhabitable Earth about how many people in China alone die from air pollution every year?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm actually working on a long piece right now about air pollution. It is really bad. It is, sometimes I think it may be even a bigger problem than climate change.
Right. In America, it's 350,000 Americans die, you say in this article, from air pollution every year.
Which is as many people as died last year of COVID. So every year we have as many Americans dying of air pollution as died last year in the pandemic. And of course, we're doing very little about it globally. You're talking about 10 million people every year dying from air pollution, which is, obviously it's a death toll greater than the whole Holocaust. It's 2.5 times the death toll of the deadliest year of the Holocaust every single year. 8.7 million of those, it's estimated, are from the burning of fossil fuels. So, air pollution, you can sort of think of it as a separate issue of climate change, but it's largely produced by the same thing that produces climate change, which is burning fossil fuels. And when you look around the places in the world where they have the most pollution, it's even more harrowing. So in India, the average resident of Delhi loses 9 years of life expectancy because of the air pollution. Their lives are 9 years shorter, which means since some people aren't dying of air pollution in Delhi, that means the average person who is dying of air pollution is probably losing like a couple of full decades off their life. Across the whole country, it's 6 years, and the country as a whole is losing something like 8% of GDP every single year just due to air pollution, not even climate effects. They have 350,000 stillbirths and miscarriages every year in India because of air pollution. I mean, that is just,
it's genocidal. I mean, that's something.
And then layer on top of that, 90% of the world now lives in places where green energy should be cheaper than dirty energy, which means that like the logic that, centrist economists would have put forward even 5 years ago, certainly 10 or 20 years ago, that like, yes, there are pollution costs, but on the whole, these people benefit over time. It's like, no, actually, they would be more prosperous and much healthier in the very short term if we found a way to help them over this sort of transition hump. And that's where, there's this big issue at COP. It's been going on for decades now, where the poor countries in the world are like, we need money to make this transition. And the rich nations of the world are like, here, have a few pennies.
Right.
And that's basically, that we're repeating that again. In Paris, the rich nations of the world promised $100 billion a year. They haven't fulfilled it to this point. And they're asking now to be celebrated for promising again to just give $100 billion a year when, depending on who's doing the asking from the global south, the ask is now at least $750 billion. Some asks are $1 trillion or more. So we're like woefully failing the people who've done the least to cause the problem, who are going to suffer most in part sort of by geographical accident, but also who are least resourced to respond and protect themselves going forward. And it's really, I mean, when you think of it in those terms and think about how responsible the U.S. in particular is, towering over all the other countries of the world, including China.
So let's put that into perspective, because China is often the boogeyman in this scenario. I think it looms large in people's imagination simply because of how much of the world's population lives there. But in fact, they're the third biggest?
Well, so they're the biggest in present tense emissions, which means this year and last year and then the next few years, they're going to be the biggest. But carbon has this really interesting quality, which is that it doesn't dissipate when it gets into the atmosphere. It actually hangs there for centuries, which means every piece of carbon that we've put into the atmosphere since the beginning of industrialization is still heating the planet today. So historical emissions, past emissions, they're not really in the past. Like, they're still heating the planet. They're still here, and they're the reason why we have a climate crisis. And so, we have to worry about the trajectory of Chinese emissions. We have to worry about the trajectory of Indian emissions. We have to worry about the trajectory of sub-Saharan African emissions, because what happens now is going to dictate the future. But we are where we are today on the brink of, climate disaster because of what's been done in the past. And that was done overwhelmingly by, the countries of the global north, and chief among them, the U.S., who's produced 1/5 of all historical or legacy emissions that have ever been produced in the history of humanity. China's in second in that ranking, but they have only half as many historical emissions. And of course, they have 4 times as many people.
Right.
So on a per capita basis, the damage that we've done is whatever that works out to, 6 or 8 times as bad as China has managed. And there's no way, given the pace of green technological change, that China is ever going to catch up with us. So
you also get a lot of hand-wringing about this idea that you get these pictures of, people in Africa cooking on little jikos. We call them in Kenya, little personal little cooking gas-powered devices, on the side of the road or whatever, or wood, and see a little plume of smoke coming out of the top of a dwelling. And the idea, there's this kind of spear-mongering that this is what's driving it, and all these people are going to come up and develop, and there's population fear-mongering about what's going on in sub-Saharan Africa, which, you write, is only responsible for under 3% of the century's emissions, of the 21st century's emissions.
Yeah, and 21st century, we'll see how that plays out. Probably it'll grow over time, but to this point, I think it's somewhere between 2.5. Yeah, and we have this sort of our culture, American culture, Western culture tells us that like wealth is clean. Like when we think about rich people and their beautiful skin, we think, oh, this is like these people are pure. And poverty is dirty.
Pure Botox.
Yeah, right, exactly. When we think about people living in squalor elsewhere in the world, we think that they are dirty. But on the climate metrics, like the opposite is really, really strikingly the case. That somebody who's living in, Kenya has, 1/20th the carbon footprint, maybe even less than the one that I do. And not to mention people who are living in like Chad or Mali, who are, maybe 1/100th. as significant a contributor to the carbon problem as you or I are. And yet those are the places that are already being hit hardest and are going to be hit even more hard in the decades ahead, which is, given where they are now, you can really, you don't have to worry that like the United States civilization is going to collapse. But like a lot of these other poor countries of the world are much closer to disarray and can be really, really damaged, producing huge amounts of human suffering if their ecological conditions degrade just a little bit, if their agricultural yields decline just 10%. They don't need to decline 50%.
Right. So you write about like the possibility that droughts in the near future could last 20 months on average in sub-Saharan Africa. And you write about how there's already cities in India where the temperature is so high that it's potentially fatal, something like 100 days out of the year, and that could go to 200 days out of the year. And so these are real world life or death effects that have people basically living in a dune-style landscape or entire countries disappearing. I mean, a leader of some island nation, was it Tuvalu, gave that speech from a podium kind of knee-high in water, demonstrating the threat that his country and other countries might actually be gone at the point at which some of these emissions cut points, these emission goal points are actually reached.
Yeah, I just read today that the Tuvalu is looking into how they can secure their own sovereignty in the event that all of their land is lost. Like legally, they're trying to figure out how they can, if they have to like move their people to another country, can they remain a sovereign nation, which is, I mean, on some level, just a fascinating geopolitical question, but also like a horrifying fact about the near future.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously have a Star Trek example for every such thing, but in Star Trek, they're typically, when there are these refugee crises, there's attempts to find an uninhabited planet. There's only this one we've got so far, although, Elon's on it. I want to put this into just a little bit of perspective also. You mentioned that the Global South was asking for $100 billion at COP21, not paid, and that they brought up the $100 billion again at COP26. A South African diplomat proposed a target of $750 billion, and John Kerry scoffed. He said he balked, not wanting to discuss the matter further. To put that in perspective, that is less than last year's military spending, right? From just one country, from our country. And we're talking about the survival of huge swaths of our human community.
Yeah, I mean, I think of it in terms of the, vaccine diplomacy. Like it would have been even the most cold-hearted calculus about how Americans might benefit. It's like if we vaccinated the entire world, the economic returns were estimated would be like, I don't know, something like 20 or 30 fold over what the investment was required. And of course, we have expressed basically no interest in spending that money. And I really, this has been a long worry of mine about climate, but it as we like head further into temperature rise, it becomes like sort of more and more close at hand. It's that, people in countries like ours will worry about their own self-interest, will worry about climate change as long as it, in terms of how it affects them, but will choose to essentially define the suffering of people living elsewhere in the world as insignificant or even to a certain degree natural. And I think that it's this poisonous idea that like when we think about drought or famine in East Africa, we're like, oh, that's just how it is. Right. Well, no, it's that way in part because they are already experiencing the effects of climate change, which is the result of, to some large degree, American emissions, more broadly, the emissions of the global north. That is like a very direct cause and effect. And while we sometimes comfort ourselves by thinking about climate change as being caused by the Industrial Revolution, so we think of it as like a centuries-old debt, more than half of the emissions that have been produced in the whole history of humanity have come in the last 25 years, which means we're really doing this damage now. So it's like, it is my generation, it is your generation, and certainly the generation of Joe Biden, who's been alive for basically 90% of all historical emissions.
Yeah, I liked that point in the article. I was like, I don't know if this is shade or not, but yeah, Joe Biden old, 90% of emissions during his lifetime.
But I mean, I'm 39 and I've been alive for 2/3 of that of that story. That is really crazy.
Yeah.
And since Biden and Obama were elected, it's 25%. Like since Barack Obama accepted the Democratic nomination, saying this is the moment that the rise of the seas began to slow and the planet began to heal. He literally said that when he accepted the Democratic nomination. Since that point, we've done a quarter of all the damage that we've ever done in the entire history of humanity. And what I worry about, I am somewhat optimistic, which we can talk about in a second, about the sort of the way that the future, some worst case scenarios now seem considerably less likely. We're still going to be heading into a grim climate future, but it's not nearly as grim as I thought was possible a few years ago. But it's not a coincidence, I think, that our likely end game here is a level of warming that is like manageable for countries like the US and, across Europe, and even in some cases may benefit some of those countries, but will be completely unforgiving, brutal to people in South Asia, the Middle East, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And I say in the piece, it's probably not a coincidence that that's the point that we're landing at. The place where the rich people in the world, they're going to suffer a little bit, but they're not going to be catastrophically impacted. But all the people whose lives have basically been discounted by the modern West for generations, their lives are really, really going to suffer. And I don't think many people, in the U.S. think about it in those terms. I think they think of it in terms of Democrats versus Republicans, believing in science versus not believing in science. Not the fact that we are rich means that we have a sort of guilt or debt towards all the poor in the world that's pretty directly calculable.
So I want to get to that argument in the conversation about climate reparations. The point you raised just now, though, about it being a kind of a very familiar argument about the 1% versus everybody else, I think is really resonant, specifically to this audience, where Birdie Bros abound. What is it that the richest top 10% alone, the emissions by the richest top 10% alone of folks is set to exceed the 1.5 degree level by 2030? Like the emissions that will get us over 1.5 degrees by the 2030 cut point?
Yeah, I mean, just to be just some level setting. So 1.5 degrees, everybody, every activist, and now every global leader is endorsing this target. The IPCC did a scientific report that came out earlier this year. They said, first of all of their modeled scenarios, including that one which was literally designed to allow us to avoid 1.5 degrees, even that scenario, but all the other ones too, we're now going to pass 1.5 degrees. They said in the one that is supposed to allow us to stay below 1.5 degrees, there's a chance that if we do enough methane drawdown and large-scale carbon removal in the second half of the century, we could pass 1.5 and then come back down. That's possible. I think within the laws of physics, they're right. That is possible, but it's like a triple bank shot kind of maneuver. So they're saying even in the emission scenario they designed to allow us to stay below 1.5 degrees, we're not going to stay below.
We're past 1.5. But even
they also said, they also said 1/3 of warming to this point has been masked by aerosol pollution, which is to say the pollution that we were talking about earlier that's killing 10 million people a year. It's also cooling the planet because it reflects sunlight back into space. And that means that if we didn't have that pollution, if we weren't killing those 10 million people a year, we would probably be at about 1.8, 1.9, maybe even north of 2 degrees already. Now, scientists say that it's possible, again, with really aggressive methane reduction, which has been a big talking point at Glasgow, that we could sort of counteract the effect of that, of eliminating that air pollution. But it is useful, I think, to sort of do a basic, we are sort of at 1.8 degrees right now. We're not at 1.3 degrees. And so anytime people are talking about this is going to push us past 1.5, we're basically without some really miraculous...
The point I'm trying to make is actually not about the 1.5. It's about the fact of the proportionality of who is causing the bulk of emissions. So whatever the new goals are, the point is that even if everyone else stopped emitting 100%, like there were no emissions from 90% of the planet, the top richest 10% alone would have had us zooming past that point if they didn't change their behavior.
I think the top 10% of the world is responsible for about 50% of all emissions, and the top 1% has an even more disproportionate footprint because of all their airplane flying. So you have the rich. I mean, and the rich people in the U.S. who fly a ton are like the equivalent of 200 people in Nigeria or 500 people in Mali or something.
And when you say rich people in the U.S. who fly a ton, I want to drill down on exactly who that is. Are we talking about people who make $100,000 a year who fly 4 times a year? Are we talking business travelers who are making over $400,000 a year?
Well,
and flying weekly.
The more flying you do, the worse you are. And in general, that's just correlated with how rich you are. But, to put it in perspective, a single economy class seat on a transatlantic flight from New York to Paris, a single seat one way produces 1 ton of carbon, which is more than the average of all 800 million sub-Saharan Africans. And that 1 ton of carbon is sufficient to melt something like 9 tons of Arctic ice. So every seat on every plane that flies from New York to Paris is doing that amount of damage
Wait,
business class is
what?
worse. Private flying is worse. Yeah.
Wait,
I mean, there's
I'm
a lot
sorry.
of ice in the Arctic. So, melting tons of ice is
Yeah,
not.
but there's a lot of seats on a plane.
Yeah. And there are a lot of planes in the sky. Yeah. I mean,
All right.
thinking globally, airline emissions is not a huge part of the problem. It's something like under 5%. But for the richest, it's like a huge contributor because it's just such a disproportionate impact. And unfortunately, we're really far from anything like zero carbon jet fuel. It's like at best 2 or 3 decades away. We're unlike with renewable power or whatever. We don't have the tools we need to like make that clean. And probably over the next couple of decades, we expect many more people are going to be flying, not fewer, because the world's going to, in the developing world's going to get richer.
So this is the perspective I want to bring into just drilling down before we move on to the reparations point about what is in fact in the BBB, which isn't passed and is still subject to change. The $550 billion over 10 years, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about a lot of the stuff in there really does, when you read it, presume that the worst is coming. And the word resilience keeps coming up in a way that I find very ominous. There's money to help low-income people weatherize their homes. Who that is low-income? Like, people aren't even owning homes, but okay, fine. Low-income people to weatherize their homes. There's resilience investments for Native Americans to, I don't know, buckle down, buy ACs. Like, I don't know, like, what are they expecting? Like, what is that even? It's also dystopian. It's like, I'm thinking of doom. It's like, am I buying one of those suits that help me walk around in the desert? They're going to teach me how to sand walk. There's $320 billion in tax credits for investment in clean energy, which an article I was reading brags would lower emissions by 70% in the energy sector, which it notes is the second largest emitting sector, which piqued my interest as to what the first largest emitting sector is and why I don't see any provisions about that. That, of course, is the fossil fuel industry. And the point that has been made by other activists is there's very little here to talk about actually limiting carbon emissions, preventing new wells from being drilled, stopping new pipeline permits from being issued, which makes me feel like even though we're all supposed to be rooting for BBB, which again is not a done deal, makes me feel like the Biden administration and everyone who is kind of cheerleading right now is part of a kind of climate denialism. Yeah,
I mean, I often say like we're all sort of living in climate denial, but it's definitely true that the Biden administration, I mean, Jake Sullivan's going around like trying to bully OPEC to produce more oil. I mean, it's like, it's pretty, there's some grotesque behavior going on, and approval of new pipelines is considerably worse than that because it's a long-term investment. And just to sort of repeat some of the analysis that you made earlier about the wealthy, about fossil fuel infrastructure, existing running fossil fuel infrastructure, if they continued to be operated until the date at which when they were built, expected to run to, like if they were allowed to run for their complete lifetime, we would be well past 1.5 degrees and possibly past 2 degrees. So even if we do no new building, no new exploration, any of that, we're talking about both of these targets, one of them being totally, lost, and another one being really imperiled. So there is a sort of direct, like very clear, we have to keep it in the ground logic if we want to preserve the hope of, say, staying below 2 degrees. And yeah, there's very little energy in the US or frankly anywhere in the world about that. There is movement on coal in general, like the world is turning away from coal for a variety of reasons, including because of the air pollution stuff that we talked about earlier. And I do think that is sort of like, that will quickly become like a sort of, they call it in the industry a stranded asset, like people just will not be producing coal. But there's much, much less willingness to think about oil and gas in the same way. And there's still an enormous amount of investment in new fossil fuel infrastructure going these days. Those are investments that are designed to be paid back over the course of 30 or 50 years, which means that they are essentially building into, making inevitable all of those decades of future emissions. And there's really no way that we can pull those targets into view if that's happening. In general, this, the Biden approach, especially after Manchin pulled the CPP, has been like all carrot, no stick. So it's all incentives, it's all, tax rebates. And, I don't want to sound like too much of a cynic about that. If you look at the way that the investments that were made in the Recovery Act in 2009, which weren't even a big deal at the time, have totally transformed the renewable market in the US and actually sort of globally. It can make a huge difference. And sometimes actually it's more effective and more efficient than sort of top-down regulation. So in the US, we've had...
Cylinder worked.
In the US, we cut emissions more than the people pushing the cap and trade program said the cap and trade program would, without anything to take its place, really, just because like the market dynamics changed so much. And we are seeing that happen now around the world. And it's one reason why, we're looking at a likely future, I think now, of something like 2.5 or 3 degrees as opposed to 4 or 4.5 degrees, because it's just the market logic all around the world is like, we should be building out renewables. We shouldn't be building out dirty energy anymore. That said, tax incentives alone are not going to get our electricity grid totally cleaned up. It's not, tax incentives alone are not going to, make every car on the road an electric vehicle. There needs to be some more aggressive action, just I think from a practical perspective, but I also think just as a signaling to say, we're doing something really big here. Like the CEPP, imperfect in some ways, but Can
you explain for those who forgot about that particular little dead tidbit what that was?
That was basically it was the centerpiece of the Biden climate agenda, and it was a plan to clean up 80% or more of the American electricity grid by 2035, and it would do that with a variety of tools, but they were all sort of organized around this very clear goal of making our electricity much cleaner in ways that were verifiable, in ways that the government could punish you for failing to do, and also in ways that would eventually, that over the course of that period of time, make electricity considerably cheaper for Americans. And it was like the whole bill, basically. And then and Joe Manchin, decided not to support it, which, there are a lot of reasons to be really angry about that. But the thing that I keep thinking about is here's a senator who's got 1.7 million constituents, and he's spiking a provision that, even putting aside all the climate benefits it would have, all the public health benefits it would have created 8 million jobs. And there's just something so perverse about that. I know, we're all bored of talking about how broken the American political system is, but it really is so fucked up.
I mean, I have a note here in my notes that says accountability dash. Who can enforce the Paris Climate Agreement? Who can enforce anything that comes out of COP26 or any COP? Who can cop to the COP? And who can enforce Biden? Who can pressure? I mean, I'm using shorthand, right? But who can pressure Biden to do anything at all? And I have this note here about that Princeton study that shows that there is no relationship between what people want and what politicians are willing to do, that we don't live in a democracy, we live in an oligarchy. And is it even worth having a conversation about climate anything at any point if we don't deal with this fundamental, ground zero problem of that disconnect? And is the only environmental conversation we should have with people like Andreas Malm, who wrote the book How to Blow Up a Pipeline.
Yeah, he's got a fascinating, just the Malm-essence of the last year has been really interesting to watch. To watch him, David Remnick's interviewing him, Ezra Klein's interviewing him. He's become now this interlocutor for the center left, and he is an eco-terrorist. I mean, I'm an admirer of his, and I actually blurbed that book, but it's wild to see that figures like that. Adam Tooze just wrote a long sympathetic piece about him in the LRB, are now saying, no, there's some wisdom here. In the same way that Barack Obama gets up at COP26 and says, stay angry.
Yeah.
And
you heard it right here. Obama told you to blow up a pipeline. I didn't say it. David didn't say it. But Obama tacitly said you should blow up a pipeline. And
there is just something there was people in the climate world were so outraged when at the G20 meeting in Rome right before COP26 they took this photo where all the world leaders were flipping a coin into the Trevi fountain, which I guess is a way of expressing good luck. And it's you want luck? You people control this whole fucking system.
Yeah,
it is kind of incredible how there's no enforcement mechanism. There's no way of holding people accountable, but there's also yeah, they want to treat it as something that's beyond their control and scary as a result. And it's hard to know exactly how to respond to that politically.
The executive director of Greenpeace, Jennifer Morgan, I saw you had retweeted this, tweeted today, the new draft final decision text published today is not a plan at a COP. It's not a plan to solve the climate crisis. It's an agreement that we'll all cross our fingers and hope for the best. It's a polite request that countries maybe, possibly do more next year. That's not good enough.
Yeah,
Flip to the Trevi Fountain.
Yeah, exactly. We have made all this progress over the last year, and on some level, it's actually, I think, encouraging to me that all of that took place outside of the COP context, because where you had China making new net zero pledges, and Biden has done that, and the EU and South Korea and Japan. India did one at COP, but that they're kind of an outlier. And these are all distant net zero pledges. They're for 2050, and they're basically unachievable if we don't radically change our plans for the next decade. But even so, they represent like a new
rhetorical shift
commitment.
Yeah. Okay.
But that they were done outside of the realm. Like, if that had all happened to COP, it would be one thing. It would just say, oh, these people get together. They sort of say, what should we say? We should say this. But, Xi Jinping is like really trying to plan the next 40 years of Chinese imperial prosperity or whatever. And he actually does want to follow, he's not going to do what I would want or what, Greta would want. But like, he does want to get us to a world 30 or 40 years from now where fossil fuels are a vanishingly small part of the Chinese power mix. And that is that the fact that he came to that conclusion, not because people in a, international conference were yelling at him, but because he thinks it's in China's own self-interest to do that, is really actually quite significant. And I think it means that we may be relying on the UN and COP process a lot less than we thought we had to in the past. That's both good and bad. But, what it means for like Saudi Arabia, if there's no international enforcement mechanism, that's an open question.
So you have a lot of hot takes today, David. I'm also hearing, just like people said, reality endorsed Bernie. Reality endorsed Xi Jinping. Like, this is.
I mean, I don't want to be too favorable to Xi, but like, there is this something really rich about John Kerry going around saying, China's not up to its ambition. It's like they dramatically upped their ambition like 6 months ago, and they're, no matter what happens this century, they're never going to pass American historical emissions. So like, who are you trying to shame? Who you faulting here? Like, it's pretty rich to be, to be like shaking the finger at them. That's not to say that like, China's a perfectly good actor here, but the U.S. is, I think, in ways that almost no American really appreciates, a uniquely villainous climate actor.
Not the climate leaders that even AOC described us as being in that little clip. Okay, so I've had you here for a while, but I want to make sure that I get to this reparations point, because here's the question. This is the question I had while reading it. So your article, I'm sorry, I feel like I printed this out, and this is like the last thing I should have done for a climate conversation. My apologies. I also have some attention deficits that require this if I'm going to get through anything these days. That's not 120 characters. The article is called Climate Reparations. 1 trillion tons of carbon hangs in the air, put there by the world's rich, an existential threat to its poor. Can remove it. And you open by kind of comparing the case for reparations as made in the context of, North American slavery to the debt that's going to be owed to the global South by the global North. And you analogize it, but say there's, in some ways, this is an easier calculation to make. It's an easier argument to make because you can tabulate the cost of carbon emissions by looking at the cost of what carbon removal technologies would be per ton. And am I saying that right? Can you maybe put it in your own words?
Yeah, it's the basic idea is, we know in America there's a horrifying racial wealth gap. We know that racism, slavery, and redlining and, other discrimination has played a significant role in that. But figuring out exactly how much a role of it played compared to other factors and exactly who would owe it and to whom it's just a messy kind of math. So even if you acknowledge the sort of moral righteousness of the argument, technically it's a hard equation to solve. With climate, the damage is quantifiable. It is literally how much carbon is in the atmosphere that is our responsibility. We know exactly how much that is. And we also know exactly how much it would cost to take it out. That is literally like the definition of reparations, is like, what would it cost to repair the damage done? And the number I use in the piece is $100 a ton. That's not exactly what it would cost today to take carbon out of the atmosphere at scale using technology, but almost everyone who works in the space thinks that that is basically where we're heading within a decade or two. It also happens to be the same number that some really prominent economists calculating what's called the social cost of carbon, which is like how much damage putting carbon out into the atmosphere costs. They came to the same number, $100. So it's a really useful, $100 a ton. It's a really useful figure. So all you have to do is just multiply the amount of carbon that Americans are responsible for, which is 509 billion tons hanging up there in the atmosphere by $100 a ton. And that gives you a climate bill for the US of $50 trillion. It's a climate bill for the whole world, what it would cost to literally undo all of the climate damage that we've ever done through any emissions. It would cost about $250 trillion. Now, that's a lot. It's, more than half the world's wealth. Right. But also, you could do it over the course of a century or 2 centuries, which means that it would be considerably more manageable. And considering the US, we spent $10 trillion on COVID relief, $50 trillion over 50 years or 100 years, it starts to seem hard, but not inconceivable.
So when
not that I'm making a practical call for it. The main point here is just to quantify how much damage we've done and give it to us in a figure that will horrify
I get it.
us.
David, I love a thought experiment, which is why I'm very eager. Like, this was fascinating to me because when you were writing, you were arguing that it's just more, the concrete nature of the calculation makes it more viable in some ways, kind of rhetorically, politically, kind of as an intellectual exercise, whatever it is. My first thought was there are plenty of people, and you can dispute how they've done the calculations, who have come up with various numbers for reparations. I'm looking at somebody here on the internet saying 4.7 trillion, someone saying 1.4 trillion. There's people who've said, let's take the 1860 value of 40 acres and a mule and extrapolate out, blah, blah, blah. There's lots of ways you could do it, right?
Yeah.
And there are numbers. And what it has always seemed to me to be the case is that the case of reparations is not limited by the ambiguity of coming up with the number, or even the ambiguity of who gets the money, which people love to focus on, but I promise you I can figure it. I can explain it to you in 10 minutes. But by the fact that it's more money than anybody's willing to pay.
Yeah.
And it strikes me that it's the same issue with this climate tabulation. That the problem at the end of the day is it's more money than anybody is ever going to be willing to pay, absence pitchforks and revolution. 100%.
But on some level, that's the point I was driving at, which is to say, when you hear, leaders of rich countries of the world congratulating themselves for promising for a second time to send $100 billion a year to the global south to help them with their climate adaptation, just keep in mind that the U.S. owes $50 trillion.
Yeah.
Like, that really puts those numbers in perspective. It also puts in perspective the amount of $500 billion that we're theoretically going to be investing if some version of this bill passes in the U.S. We're talking about a moral obligation that is many, many, many multiples of anything we're contemplating spending today, even as we talk about climate as an existential threat that we need to be meeting with our whole society-wide effort. And on some level, that is like more than like the practical case. I mean, I think we will be doing carbon removal to some degree. I would like to see it managed in a progressive way rather than in a fossil fuel friendly way. I know this is something you've talked about in your podcast before. I think those arguments are quite strong. I don't think it's going to do the work that I'm sketching out in the piece of like returning us to a pre-industrial climate. But I do think that keeping in mind the scale of what it would take to do that, and remembering that it is what we're talking about in talking about that is cleaning up a mess that we have made in the U.S. in our own lifetimes is just a useful framing and framework in which to consider any discussion of any climate effort, because all of those numbers are going to be pathetically tiny compared to these numbers. And, on some level, it required like, a moral processing of what we've done requires us to be shamed by that fact and to keep it in mind. Maybe we're, I think I agree with you. I don't think we're going to get to U.S. spending $50 trillion to help the people in the global south. But as a benchmark that is always going to tell us that we're not doing enough, I think it's really useful.
Well, I think it's perhaps a good place to stop on that kind of moral quandary, because the next guest we interview is an activist who's been trying to use that kind of moral leverage to do exactly what Obama has told the youth to do. But I also want to end with a quote from your piece from friend of the show, the episode you just referenced, the carbon capture episode, Olufemi Taiwo, who wrote last year in Foreign Policy, it's going to be climate reparations or climate colonialism. These are the options. So let's buckle up, kiddos, and choose our choices. Thank you, as always, David. This has been a great conversation. Can you let our listeners know where they can find you and your work?
Yeah, I write at New York Magazine most of the time, and then I'm on Twitter at D Wallace-Wells.
Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.